This week on Snark Squad Pod, we're talking about our 2018 in media. Welcome back to Snark Squad Pod. My name is Marinez.
And I'm Nicole Sweeney. And this week we do not have a guest because we're just talking to each other again. We haven't done this in so many episodes. It's been so long. I think episode 3 is the last time it was just the two of us. But we are doing this just the two of us because we thought after a year of making this podcast, it's been a whole year now. So that's very exciting. And a lot has happened both on the podcast and also just like in general media. In getting ready to talk about this, I realized just how much stuff I managed to take in that wasn't for the podcast, which is shocking if you look at the list of shit we've talked about on the podcast. When did I do this? How did I make the time for this? Why did I make the time for this? So let's start there. Well, I want to talk about all the stuff that we actually did on the podcast too, but what was your favorite thing that you read or watched or whatever that wasn't for the podcast?
I didn't manage to do as much outside of the podcast as you. I think especially in TV and in movies, most of what I saw was either for the podcast or for Snark Squad, and the stuff that's for Snark Squad is in progress. So it's like things that I haven't finished watching, and I wouldn't feel comfortable saying "Oh, this is great," because it could all go downhill from here.
Yep,
right. But I read a lot of books. I read a lot of books every year. So I think I will end this year having read 60 books in this year. And a portion of those were for Snark Squad because we did books on throughout the season or whatnot. But one that I read, or two I'll mention, that I read and loved this year that we didn't talk about. One was The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. And it is a YA contemporary told in verse, and Elizabeth Acevedo is a slam poet, so she tells the story in verse, and I listened to it on audiobook, which was great because the author reads it, and it is a very emotional. It's about a Dominican American girl, and as a Dominican American, I found a lot there to relate to. It's one of those books that you read and I was like, man, why couldn't this exist when I was younger?
Oh, man.
I would it would have been everything to me had I also found it as a 16 or 17-year-old girl. But it was great. I think it's just a good experience, even if it's something that is not necessarily your thing. It's just a good experience in empathy and seeing something from a point of view that is probably different than your own.
I will co-sign on that rec, which I read because you recommended it. So the audiobook specifically, yes, 100%.
And it's a pretty short one too. It's a short read and a short audiobook comparatively. So
right, it's like 4 hours of your time. It's not
right.
And as someone, we have talked about this on the podcast, how I watch everything on fast forward, listen to everything on fast forward. I don't watch our movies and TV shows on fast forward, but literally everything else in my life, YouTube, podcasts, whatever, audiobooks, all of it. I'm listening at more than one time speed. And The Poet X was the rare moment in which I was like, no, I can listen to this at one time speed. I want to hear the cadence as it was intended.
That's beautiful. as somebody who also listens to everything on fast forward and wishes frequently I could fast forward TV shows.
Oh, yeah, right.
That's high praise. The other book that I wanted to mention is one that I literally just finished reading, and it already was okay, yes, this was one of the best things that I read all year, but it's Circe by Madeline Miller. I have not read Madeline Miller's first book, which was The Song of Achilles, which I know has a pretty big following, and people waited a long time for her second book, but I just jumped to the second book, and it is a retelling or a reimagining of the Greek mythology, the character Circe's whole entire life story, basically. And so you follow her from when she was born into, she's immortal, so not the end of her life, but you follow her through her life, and it's just a romp of a good time. I don't know. It's like, it reminded me a lot of why I loved the Odyssey when I read it in school, but it has that adventure feel of like moving from one thing to the next. But this is also a character study, so it's not, I don't know, it's so weird. It's not like you're necessarily waiting for those adventure plot points. You're more focused on how she's developing as a character. So it's a good balance of both of those things. And for anybody who has any kind of knowledge of Greek mythology, it's just fun to see all of these characters dip in and out through the lens of Circe and Miller's reimagining. So I highly recommend that one as well.
I also read quite a few books, not for the podcast. I last year set a Goodreads goal of 50 books that I failed. So this year I was like, okay, I'm only going to set my goal at 30, but then I'm going to hit 50 books this year. So, so I don't know, whatever. In part because I've been listening to a lot more audiobooks, I think, than I ever did before. But So I have a couple books that I read this year that we did not talk about on the podcast that were truly fantastic. I mentioned in the spoilers episode, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid, which I absolutely adored. Evelyn Hugo is an old Hollywood movie star, and she's basically telling the story of her life to a journalist. And the audiobook is great because there's 3 different voice actors. There's a voice actor for the journalist, there's one for Evelyn Hugo, and then there's another one for these like little gossip rag like blurbs that happen in between things. And so that was really delightful and good. And I actually I want to read the book in a physical form because I kind of want to see what that layout looks like. After hearing it. But anyway, the story is fantastic. I mentioned the bisexual representation that I greatly appreciated, and it was just like a really, really good time. The other thing I want to mention is all 3 Daughter of Smoke and Bone books, which were obviously not like new this year. Laini Taylor has other books out this year, but I just discovered them this year, and I loved them, and they were great.
That makes me so happy because I love those books as well. And so it's funny because you had one book that I haven't read, which is Evelyn Hugo, and then books that I had. And same with me. I had one book you hadn't read. So go read Circe and I'll read Evelyn Hugo. But yes, I love the Daughter of Smoke and Bone trilogy. It's probably not for everybody because it's very angsty and flowery, but man, it is like YA done right in that sense. Like some of the tropey things that I found in other books that I don't like, I saw Laini Taylor do it and I was like, yes, living for all of the like angsty romance in the middle of like a war. Like, yes, give it to me.
It felt like almost like a writing challenge of here's a list of tropes and things that frequently annoy me. Now make them work.
Yes.
Outside of books, I have also seen quite a few movies this year that we didn't talk about on the podcast. Some of them quite recently. Actually, to that end, I saw Into the Spider-Verse this week at the time that we're recording this podcast, whatever. I just to add to the chorus of people saying how great this movie is fucking great. The most fun I had at the movies all year. It's just so good. It's so good. Someone in the SnarkSquad Discord mentioned going to see the movie with a partner, and like the movie finished and the partner was like, that movie was better than it had any right to be. And I feel like that's it. That's Into the Spider-Verse, better than it has any right to be.
I was literally sitting here trying to think if I saw any movies besides the one that I had to watch as homework. I honestly don't think I went to the theaters this year, like outside of SnarkSquad. So, woo.
2 other sort of honorable mentions, nowhere near as fantastic as Into the Spider-Verse, but honorable mentions. Bad Times at the El Royale was weird and good, and A Simple Favor, also weird and good. What about TV shows? Did you watch? Just no TV shows outside of SnarkSquad assignments?
No. Oh no! See, I was gonna say I started watching Anne with an E, which I did start watching Anne with an E, but I haven't finished watching it. So I don't know, man.
That's fair. I don't know that I have finished anything that we haven't also discussed on the podcast. I recently started watching Elementary because that's like the most so like Mari's thing is starting stuff and then walking away from it. Mine is there's things I should be doing and I don't want to, so why don't I start watching this 7-season TV show?
Sounds about right.
So I started watching that. That's been a delight. I started watching it actually specifically because we were talking about the BBC Emma, and I was going to watch that again, but then, I don't know, my brain was just like, oh yeah, Mr. Knightley is also Sherlock Holmes. And now that's a thing that I'm
here
watching.
You are.
Yeah, now here I am. And because I'm me, I will eventually finish it. So...
To be fair, I mean, I do use media in that same way where, like, I should be doing something else. But then there's no payoff because I never actually finish it. So it's like double the waste of time.
Okay. What about of the stuff that we actually like talked about on the podcast?
There were a few things that I really, really, really loved, and that I'm so happy that I was encouraged to watch because of the podcast. One that it's like at the forefront for me is Crazy Ex-Girlfriend. I feel like that is a show that we do not deserve. I often think about how wild it is that show exists in the format that it exists and just everything that it has to say. I love that show so much, and I don't think that I would have watched it had it not been for you, Nicole, like putting it on the list and being like, this is a thing. And not only is this a thing, but you're going to watch all existing seasons.
Commit.
So yeah, and I think it helps that we got to see Crazy Ex-Girlfriend live. So they did a live touring show, and we watched it for Nicole's birthday. And that I hadn't even finished the series when I went to go watch the live show. But after I watched the live show, I was like, oh my gosh, like this is amazing. I can't wait to finish it. So that is definitely at the top of my list.
My sort of same kind of example, something that I consumed solely because it was a podcast thing, would definitely be The Last Airbender. That like 100% would not have watched that. Would not have made the decision to watch 3 seasons of a cartoon. But I'm very glad that I did. It's very good and pure, and I loved it with my whole heart.
That's so exciting. We picked 2 examples. One was like a thing you liked that I watched, and then one was one of my favorites that you watched. Look at this podcast at work. I mean,
we're doing it.
We're doing it.
On the other end of the spectrum, the hours of my life that I'll never get back, the greatest offense has to be Midnight Texas. I forgot. My brain, I had completely like erased that from my memory, like forgotten that had happened. But I was like scrolling through the list of things we talked about this year, and I saw it, and I was like, oh, that.
I think that Avatar, the movie, was a pretty big offense too.
Sure.
But it's shorter, and I think that it was shorter, which is probably...
That's huge. That's a huge factor.
But also I think that there was an amount of like so bad, not so bad it's good, but it was like so bad that it was fun to talk about and laugh about and kind of figure out. Midnight Texas started off that way, being like cheesy fun, this is bad. And then it built to a point where I was like, by the end, I was so upset.
Yes.
I was just so upset by everything that it did.
For the first like 7 episodes, I was like, okay, this is like fun and cheesy, and then it just took a turn that I was like, fuck you, show. Oh, I forgot something else. Another, I don't know, thing that I loved that I would not have gotten to had it not been a recommendation for the podcast. Eliza and Her Monsters. That was a delight of a book.
I agree. It was kind of on my radar because I had heard Sam from Thoughts on Tomes, who's been a guest on here a few times gush about it, but this literally was a pick where we asked Chelsea, what should we read? And she was like, this one now. So it definitely,
thanks, Chelsea.
It got pushed up both our list. I mean, pushed up my list and put on your radar.
Placed on there at all.
Yeah. I loved it too. And it's one that like grew in my feelings the more distance that we have from it. I wouldn't expect that to be one that kind of like stayed with you because it was like a contemporary and those are things that usually aren't very like haunting or anything like that. But it really has just cemented itself in my feelings as something that I think about, especially like thinking about like internet culture and everything that she dealt with there. And I just loved it a lot. I've got another one too that I think was really great, and I watched this not for the podcast, let it be known, but then I immediately was like, let's talk about it on the podcast. And it's The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, which is delightful. I haven't watched season 2 yet, but it's almost because season 1 was so good that I'm a little bit afraid.
I just finished watching season 2, and I still love this show with my whole entire heart, but season 1 is
oh no,
yeah. Season 1 is better. It's not that's all there is to it. Like, I still love the show.
You can't say this to the anti-completionist.
Sorry. I'm just saying, if you want to just keep watching season 1 over and over again, you'd probably be fine.
Okay, great. We could probably sit here and just keep like gushing about some of the things that we watched this year. But we also got some questions over on Twitter about the media that we consumed in 2018. So let's pull some of those up right now.
The first one is, what was your biggest cram session / accomplishment?
All of the Game of Thrones ones, probably.
Like, there's really, you can't top that.
I mean, to be fair, the Game of Thrones things were of our own making because we usually planned them out like a few months in advance, and we just didn't read them until the very last possible moment. But we did schedule ourselves into some pickles sometimes. Yeah. I mean, knowingly. Like, Sabrina came out on Friday and we were recording on Sunday. So we did a couple of those where it was like a Friday release. And so we were basically committing our Saturday and Sunday to binge watching whatever it was that had just come out. So I think those were pretty impressive too.
Yeah. Sabrina Maniac was also like that. With the A Song of Ice and Fire books, the putting it off, obviously, yes, a lot of that is just us being procrastinators. But I will also say that there were a couple times where I did start the book. 1 or 2 of the books I started not long after we recorded, the one episode. I was like, okay, got to start the next book. But it 2 months was so long. I'm like, I don't know if I can, hold on to all of the particular details and stuff to be able to have this conversation, especially with all of the other stuff that we were doing in between. The idea of spending 2 months with one of those books to get ready to have those conversations was just not really feasible for me anyway. So I don't know. It's not just us being procrastinators is what I'm trying to say.
There were definitely times that I was like, okay, this is it, me starting early. And then my brain would go, no.
I don't want it.
Yeah. That was another weird prologue with a rapey man. No. I'd be like, you're right, brain. You're right. I've got 2 months to do this.
Good point.
The next question is, did sharp objects sit with you for a while, or did your brain dismiss it after the podcast? Do you still think you'll revisit eventually?
First of all, I don't remember saying I would revisit it eventually. I'm sure I did. I not to be clear, this isn't, I'm not doubting the questioner, but I feel like that's a partial answer to this question is of how little thought I've given it since then. And honestly, no, I don't think I will.
I think we ended that episode talking about the hidden words in the episodes or whatnot.
Right.
So there was a little bit of I would like to go back and see what I pick up because there was a lot of hidden in the episode. But yeah, it definitely was good, and it definitely sat in my feelings after I watched it And I thought I will go back to this. But yeah, since then my brain was like, no, you won't.
No, you won't.
So, yeah.
Well, to this end, so there's another question on here, which was, what was the hardest piece of content to get through? Not because you didn't like it, but because the subjects or plot hit you personally or caused a visceral reaction or it was difficult for some reason. And this isn't so much the show as it was the book, which I read right before I started watching the show, maybe like a couple weeks before. And I, for my own like mental health purposes, I should not have finished that book. It was just, I don't know. It was the most like triggered I have ever felt by a piece of media was like reading that book. And I don't know, I happened to be reading it on a plane. And so when, like, I remember feeling like I probably should stop doing this, but because I was on an airplane, I felt like, I don't know, like, what else am I going to do? And so I did not stop, and I, like, pushed through till the end, and that was genuinely a terrible idea. And so I think all things related to sharp objects are sort of, like, the show did, because I had already had that experience with the book, I went into the show much more prepared, and so I didn't have any problems watching the show. But because the book lives in that place in my feelings, like that, like, wow, this was actually harmful to me place, I have a really hard time being like, yeah, let's go watch that. Like, that's what I'm going to do with a Saturday. So
right. I think for me, there are moments that stick out in my head. So a lot of the Theon content in A Song of Ice and Fire was super tough to get through. Even knowing where it was going and all, it just didn't make it any easier. I didn't like any of that. And then, like, there was a moment in Annihilation that really sticks out to me. They're like cutting him open or whatever. And I don't even really know what happened because I didn't see it and it was still hard to get through. So things like that, like, stick out in my head. But I think the piece of content that was genuinely just the most difficult for me to get through was The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. And I understand how, like, you know, how much of a wuss that makes me sound like. But honestly, I think more than anything, like, I had built it up in my head. Or, like, I was always waiting, like, tense, waiting for something to happen that would not be good for me to watch or enjoyable for me to watch. So the entire time I was just tense.
Right. You're just like tense and anxious the entire time. So there's no enjoyment.
Yes. No, there was very, very little enjoyment there.
Big same on a lot of the A Song of Ice and Fire stuff, for sure. There are definitely moments there. That's like a tricky one because obviously that was a little bit more mixed than, you know, obviously Sabrina and my experience with sharp objects. Like, those are much more like the totality of the thing, which I think is probably the best answer to this question. But for sure, there are large sections of the A Song of Ice and Fire books that were like just deeply, deeply, viscerally uncomfortable to get through. Also, this isn't, so I'm consuming it in 2018, but it's actually for like, this is a small nod to the next episode of the podcast. But I'm currently making my way through Vicious, and the middle section of that book would also go on this as my answer to this question, but we'll talk about that next week.
I'm very excited because I haven't started it. I don't remember what the middle section of the book is. But yeah, good preview to next week.
Great. Was there a reread or rewatch that changed your opinion of the material? So I don't have an immediate answer to this question, but like by way of like getting myself there, I will say that we are, for the site, we are now working our way through season 3 of Veronica Mars, which we started recapping Veronica Mars years ago. And then in like near the end of season 2, we were not as consistent with our posting schedule. So we were like, okay, we got to get like a little bit of a backlog going before we start posting season 3. And then we just never did. We just dropped it entirely. But we are working on it now. We want to get it. We want season 3 to be done in time for the brand new Hulu season of Veronica Mars. Season 3 of Veronica Mars is rough for me because this is like will probably forever live in my feelings as my favorite show. Like, even now, there are so many shows that I can say, oh yeah, all of these other shows are better shows, but like Veronica Mars lives in my feelings in this really, like deep and intense way. I used to watch the whole... the third season aired my freshman year of college, and then like subsequent years of college, I would watch the whole series all the way through at least once a year, often more than that. Like that was just, a thing that I would do when I was stressed. Going back to the first arc of season 3 of Veronica Mars is like a struggle now in 2018, where I'm just like the if you're not familiar with the show, the first third of season 3 is a campus rape arc, and there are just so many ways in which it's like not particularly well handled, and it's like frustrating to watch a show that had previously dealt with its main character's rape plotline so thoughtfully and well, to watch it handle this particular storyline so poorly and frustratingly is, it's just difficult to watch. So I don't know if it's that it changes my opinion of the material, but it's a different experience, I guess.
I don't know that I have a direct answer for this, but it made me think about some of the things that I reread or rewatched for the podcast that my opinion wasn't necessarily changed by the experience of rereading, but then having conversations with you and our guest, I think, framed things for me. Right. So my best example of this is My Brilliant Friend, which I still absolutely love that book, and I think I had a very similar experience rereading it than my first read, but then after our conversation it made I had to like sit back and really think about how the what's the word the weaker spots of the novel, like, I don't know, I just had to acknowledge them more, whereas before I'm like, yeah, it's really slow in the beginning, you get past that. Like, you really have to like sit there and think about the pros and cons of a thing that you really enjoy. So a lot of these conversations were interesting in that way, and that they kind of shaped my opinion or changed some of my view of the things that we were consuming.
Yeah, I would say that is a really good point, that more often it's the conversation than it is the like re-consuming experience that ends up being like formative in some way. This is like very different answer, but Cloak and Dagger was a little bit of that, because I was watching that real time and like thoroughly enjoying myself, but I don't know, just the way that I was watching it, I couldn't tell. I was like, am I like just having fun, because it's like whatever, like, teenager show, soapy teenager show, and getting to have that conversation with you and Sari was great, because like hearing both of you explain the things that you felt were genuinely good about the show, I guess. Right. It was one that when we decided we were going to talk about it, I was really not sure. Like, I was like, I think I remember the show being good, but I don't know. When we have to actually talk about it, will we decide that it was actually good? Question mark.
It was great.
On the other end of the spectrum, like Sabrina was one that while I was watching, like was that, like it was, there were a lot of things about it that were the kind of thing that I'm into, just in terms of soapy teenager shit. And then having that conversation was a lot of like, wow, yeah, that was bad. And that was bad. Well, that's a great point about that other thing that was bad. That is one that like has done like has truly tanked in my feelings after having the conversation about it. So yeah, I think more often than not, it's the conversations that end up shaping my feelings more than just the revisiting. But I guess it would be interesting to see what happens if I then like go back again, I don't know that I will with any of these things, but would be interesting.
The thing that I was most nervous about for you to consume until when I watched it, I was like, I'm pretty sure this is good, was Avatar: The Last Airbender. So when you were like, this is good, I was like, yes. Justified.
Can confirm is good.
So, based on that last comment that you made, can you pick something from the list of things that we covered this year that you're most likely to rewatch or revisit?
Ooh. Well, first I have a cheating answer. I'm scrolling through the list and
Don't say Pride and Prejudice.
Because Rosamund Pike talks me to sleep at night. So, oh, Crazy Rich Asians for sure. That's like, yes, I would watch that again. I bought all the books I used my Audible credits on all 3 of the books. I'm like, yeah, that's like, fun shit. I could see myself revisiting regularly, and the movie especially, like it's a movie. So this is the other thing. Movies are way easier, just in terms of the time commitment that it requires, and the fact that they're making a sequel to Crazy Rich Asians. Like, yeah, I will rewatch the movie at the very least before going to see the sequel, which I will also definitely go see.
I already rewatched that, actually. So after we finished the episode and I saw it in theater, I saw it with friends. So here, like in my apartment, we just rented it and watched it. So yeah, Crazy Rich Asians, good answer. Pride and Prejudice, solid answer. I probably read it like 3 times since the recording of that, at least. And my probably unpopular and weird answer is that I will read the Game of Thrones books again, for sure.
Ooh. I also own all of those with my Audible credits and whatever. I don't know, man. I bought the books on Kindle as well as like a 5-book set. Making my way through that on Kindle, that was like a genuinely annoying way to read them, and I will probably never open that file again. I don't know. The audiobooks, will I read them again? I don't know. That's, I don't know, man.
I don't even know why I want to read them again. But only that reading them the way that we read them was not the best way for me to experience those books.
Oh, sure.
And I just, now having the complete, or not the complete, but what's out there of the story, this is something that I would like to go back and kind of revisit, just strictly from the purpose of like, what else can I pick up? And then also with rereading, I feel like I have more control over like, I don't want to read this and I don't need to because it's not important.
Right.
Skip kind of thing.
Yes.
So I don't know. There's something in my brain that's been telling me to go back and give it another go. So
yeah, skip all the Theon chapters, all the many useless chapters in the 5th book.
You can skip that whole guy's
Quentin Martell.
Point. Yeah, the whole thing.
His
just
whole
skip it,
useless plot.
See, rereading is fun when you do it that way.
But you skip half the things. That's fair. That's yeah.
So one more question from Twitter about reoccurring themes that we noticed throughout the year.
I don't know if this isn't like new, but working on this podcast definitely called into focus our love of like coming of age stories.
Found families.
Yeah, found families. Every time one cropped up, it was like, yeah, this is deeply our shit.
I think that, and are probably on the other end of that is just how much we have a distaste for anti-heroes.
Yeah.
And I think there was a big theme also in being like probably hyper aware, or maybe not hyper aware, but aware of watching things through like the lens of 2018. And for the purpose of this podcast, I think we were just always talking about not only what we were consuming, but the way we were consuming it and in the context that we were consuming it. So I don't know if that has always, I've thought about that before, obviously, in consuming media, but something about doing this podcast always makes me hyper aware of like, okay, I'm watching this in this way as a binge to talk to these people. And like,
right.
Also, it was like a shitty week in 2018 politics. And all of that like informs the way that we talk about these things. So I think that was super neat.
Yeah, yes. And having to reckon with that in terms of your feelings about the thing, especially when we've had guests who were revisiting something. I think that is an especially interesting way to look at that. That usually we're finishing the thing right before we start recording, and several things that we've talked about this year like ultimately lived in my feelings fairly differently after I had some time and some distance from the thing. But like that's not usually the space where we're talking about it. You know, we're usually talking about it in the immediate aftermath. And so that's, yes, being forced to reckon with the way in which like the actual lived experience of the moment in my life and the method of consumption affected my relationship with a piece of media has been a really, really interesting part of this process.
I think also a big theme for us, and it started to develop pretty early on, was this idea of something being enjoyable versus good.
Oh, yes.
Like quality versus, you know, maybe not quality, but what is quality anyways? And like spinning in circles.
This is a topic that we have talked about doing an episode about for a really long time. Just FYI.
And we always get there and we're like, I don't know, man. I don't know. But just kind of defining those terms and learning how to talk about something that we find enjoyable or like personally good, but also learning to deal with the fact that those things are still opinions when you're talking about things that are good or quality or whatnot. And I don't know, figuring out the language of having to talk about these things in that way.
Right. Like your metrics for quality, like being very clear about when you're trying to separate out, do I enjoy this from, is this good? Like that conversation often has a way of framing the first as subjective and the second as objective, and like that's still yes, do I enjoy this is purely subjective, but also there are a lot of ways in which is this good is also mostly subjective, and like the closest you can get to making it objective-ish is to be really clear about like what you mean when you say good. Like what specific criteria are you factoring in to your definition of good, which has been a really interesting also just part of this process, like the having to get clearer about how we are each defining those terms and like the ways and like places in which we're defining those terms. I don't know. I'm also really curious. We're not very good at asking for feedback on specific points, but this is something that, like we said, this is something we've talked about a ton, between us. We talk about it a little bit on the podcast, but we talk about it like a fuck ton just between the two of us on Discord and stuff. And I am really curious how other people think about this, like how other people frame this idea of enjoyable versus good, and like what does good even mean in that context? And I don't know. I find that really interesting. So if you have any thoughts on that, please tweet them at us or come leave them in a comment on this blog post or whatever. So is there any other feedback that you would like to ask of our audience while we're soliciting this feedback?
I'm always super interested in hearing what you guys would like us to cover on this podcast. If you guys have any piece of media or tropes, we have the trope episodes, which are some of my favorite to do. So if there's any trope that you would like us to cover, a piece of media, let us know. I think that even if we don't get to it immediately, it goes on our list, but also it's super interesting to hear the kinds of things that you would like us to cover and why. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's like, this thing is very good, please talk about it, and sometimes it's like, LOL, this thing is very bad, and I would like you to justify it being very bad. So you're right. So both of those things are great. Let us know what you would like to see happen in 2019. And on the subject of feedback, we thought it would be fun to also read some of the reviews that we've gotten over on iTunes. It's not very many that we've gotten, but they've, we really appreciate everybody who took the time to subscribe, rate, and review this year. Thank you so much for supporting the podcast in that way. And yeah, thank you even to this. Oh, well, let's start with the bad. To this one guy. It's actually our most recent review. It's a 1-star review, and it's called Laugh Track. I've got to do it justice. Mm-hmm. I've never heard such squawking, screeching, cackling, and giggling in my life. Nothing even mildly amusing needs to be said. These people react to every word uttered by one of their crew as if they just sat through a Jerry Seinfeld monologue. One woman said boobs. Nothing else, just that one word, and they all carried on as if they had told a joke for the ages. I love the concept of the podcast, being a TV fan, but this is unbearable.
I like that Jerry Seinfeld is the metric for peak comedy. So cool.
90s white man. Yeah, sure. Peak comedy. Was this review helpful? No. I mean, when this review first appeared, which it was like our first probably negative or bad review on there, we did have a moment of like, well, we do giggle a lot, but also who's not a fan of happiness? I don't know.
As our friend Taylor said, it's basically women are experiencing joy and I hate it. It's like right? What this review is. I don't know. Shrug.
Also, boobs are funny, so I don't know what to tell you other than. And I'm sure that there was some context for the boobs.
Probably. On the other end of the spectrum, the very first review that we got just a couple weeks into us making this podcast was actually very sweet and lovely. And honestly, most of the reviews we've gotten have been very lovely and supportive, and that's been great. But Blog to Pod. I'm so thrilled that my snarky ladies have decided to begin a podcast. As a longtime lover of their website, I am stupid stoked to join them while they work out podcasting kinks in my ear holes while bringing their special brand of sass along. So that warms my heart. Thank you so much, Blue 12.
And honestly, thank you to all of you guys who really stuck with us as we were working out podcasting kinks.
Yes.
I think that we definitely approached this from the angle of we will make the thing and figure it out as we go. And so for you all to join us for that and have patience, and even still as we're continuing to hopefully
we're still figuring it out. Yeah.
Figuring it out. We really appreciate it. And that's why we enjoy all of your feedback as well. As much as we can, sit here and have a giggle and, take it in that kind of light. We do really appreciate the feedback because we are trying to make this the best that it can be and continue to work out the kinks.
Also, to that end, if you ever would like to send us a message about something, I don't know, that you don't want to put on in a public review on iTunes or on Twitter or whatever, we have a contact form on the website, or you can just email us at team@snarksquad.com. We would always love to hear from you. This is now the moment where it would make sense for us to start winding down, but I just realized that when we were talking about media for the year, we didn't talk about podcasts at all. We make a podcast, so I don't want to have this detour be too long. So, but I do really quickly want to mention some of the podcasts that I've been loving this year. I discovered By the Book this year, which is a podcast in which two friends read self-help books. They live by self-help books for 2 weeks, and it's amazing. I love it with my whole heart. It's delightful, and I highly recommend it.
I think one of the podcasts that you introduced me to that has been my favorite probably for the year is Fansplaining. And it is the kind of thinky thought media commentary stuff that I really enjoy and love. So that's definitely at the top of my list for 2018. In addition to Fansplaining, I've listened to so many podcasts this year, and I think that's probably another piece of the time that wasn't going to TV and movies, but a lot of it was work/research, as I have been helping to organize PodCon, which is an event that's happening in Seattle in January, and it is for fans of podcasts, which if you're listening to this, I'm assuming that you are. So it's a super cool event. You guys should definitely check it out, and Nicole and I will both be there. We'll both be working for part of the time. I mean, I'll be working all of the time. Nicole will be working some of the time. So, but we will be around, and we'd love to say hello to you guys if you are there. We'd love to chat, meet you, take pictures, whatever it is. So yeah, let us know if you'll be at PodCon. Hopefully you guys can make it out.
And for those of you that can't hang out with us in person in Seattle, as much as we would very much love to, we would also very much love to hang out with you online, which you can do either by joining our Discord or by joining our community on Patreon. We are going to start doing monthly live streams for real in 2019. We've had them as like a thing that we were planning on doing for quite some time now and have not been the best about making the time for it, but we are going to start putting those on the schedule. So like that's a thing that's going to happen, and polls for content and all sorts of other fun stuff. And we would love it if you would consider joining us there at patreon.com/SnarkSquad.
And that's it for us this week. Thank you all for listening, and thank you for sending in your questions and all of your feedback. We'd love to hear from you about everything that we've mentioned in this podcast over at the post dedicated to this episode on SnarkSquad.com. As always, you can also find us on Twitter at Snark_squad. You can find me at My Name is Marines.
I am at Sweeney Says.
Thank you to Stefan Chin, as always, for the fancy theme music that is playing us out right now. We'll be back in your feed next week. Bye.
Bye.